I mean, whatever one thinks about Mao's China, it had pretty successful health outcomes. Actually, it's interesting the way this is dealt with here. The main person who's studied, the economist who studied famines and social policy and their effects is Amartya Sen, won the Nobel Prize for this work, a very important work. Half of his work is known. The other half, which is in the same papers, is not known. What his main studies, he and his colleague Jean Dres, compared China and India, which is a good comparison. I mean, they're both colonized, became independent at the same time, late 40s, and they were different countries.
Large population.
Yeah, and similar in many ways, levels of development and so on. Well, one of his main contributions was studying the terrible Chinese famine in 1958-60, when maybe 20 million people died, big, terrible famine, and he treats that as a political crime, basically an ideological crime. It's not that the center wanted to kill people, it's that they didn't get any information. Totalitarian society, you don't get a flow of information up and back, and simply didn't know what was happening, and no critical commentary, and they couldn't do anything about it. In India, he points out, which is a capitalist democratic society, they did get information, so there were flows of information up and back, and criticism and so on. And India never suffered any such famines after the British were kicked out. There were plenty of them before. But since independence, hadn't had a major famine. And this is the well-known part of Amartya Sen's work, shows how awful the communists are. Take a look at the same papers, and the other half of the paper does a different analysis. It compares mortality rates in India and China since independence. Well, in China, they went way down because they instituted rural health programs and barefoot doctors and preventive medicine for the huge, rural, overwhelmingly rural population. In India, they didn't. They followed capitalist principles. You don't do anything for people, do it on their own. Well, it turns out that the death rates in India declined much more slowly. And if you look at the gap, well, I'll just quote their own conclusion. What they say is every 8 years, India put as many skeletons in its closet as China did during its years of shame. Meaning during the period that they studied, 1947 to 1979, that's 100 million extra deaths in India. Well, that's pretty serious. And that's also, they treat that as an ideological crime too. Comes from government policies. You could have carried out preventive medicine and rural health care and so on, but they didn't. Well, that half of the study is unknown, unreported. When Sen got his Nobel Prize, I didn't see a single mention of it, and it's hard to miss. It's in the same papers, the same books, but it doesn't fit the requirement. So that's our ideological crime. It doesn't fit our ideological requirements. It's true that for Thomas Friedman and his friends, and in fact for people like me, people in our income bracket, oh yeah, sure, it's been great. In fact, for the top 0.5% of the population, it's just magnificent. So call it a golden age, if you like, but certainly not for the population. He hasn't a clue what. I mean, take his favorite example, India, which just dazzles him. Marvelous labs in Hyderabad. Yeah, it's true. I've been in the labs in Hyderabad. They're better than MIT. A couple of miles away, the rate of peasant suicides is rising very sharply from the same policies. You turn government funding into support for software engineering and take it away from rural development, support for farmers, irrigation, rural credit, and so on, and you drive farmers to export production the way he thinks is wonderful, instead of producing food for the country themselves, produce, say, cotton, which requires high inputs, a lot of fertilizer, plenty of water, which is not available, and the prices fluctuate radically. So one year you may make a lot of money. The next year you may make nothing. Well, if you're agribusiness, doesn't matter that much. Kind of levels out, and you can have other things. If you're a poor farmer and you can't sell your crops one year, you can't tell your children, "Don't worry, we don't have to eat this year. Maybe we'll eat next year." So you go into debt. Since the government doesn't provide rural credit, thanks to Thomas Friedman's policies, not of course that he instituted them, but the ones he lauded, you can't get rural credit. So you go to a usurer. It's 40% interest. Then the next year you can't pay him, so you got to sell off your land. And pretty soon your children are starving. And pretty soon you can do nothing, so you commit suicide. That's why the rate of peasant suicides is sharply rising within eyesight of the marvels that he's describing. There's also, as P. Sainath has pointed out, for the first time in Indian history, there is mass migration from the countryside. Now, there always was migration, say, for harvests, like if the harvest's over here, people go there. This is different. People are fleeing the devastated countryside where the large majority lives, and becoming essentially pouring into the Mumbai slums. You've seen them. I don't want to describe them. In fact, it's probable that the most serious economic analyses, not sort of rave reviews on the op-ed page of the Times, but real analyses, illustrate that, indicate that maybe 80% of the population or so is in the black or informal economy, meaning they're not even counted. It's not part of the country, and it goes on like that. I mean, states like Uttar Pradesh, which has about the same population as Pakistan, I mean, the conditions there, say, for women, are probably worse than under the Taliban. And go around India, yeah, that's what you find. So sure, there's improvement. I mean, there's growth, which is good. You'd like to have growth. They're improving roads, which is fine. They have a big software program. They do have great labs. Science is a different story. It's mostly engineering and commodity production. But for most of the population, it's hardly heaven, very far from it. And India is one of the better stories because they didn't observe the neoliberal rules. They maintained control over capital flow, over finance, and violated IMF rules in many ways. The countries, on the other hand, that adhered to them, Latin America had the most rigorous adherence to the rules that he recommends. Were the worst disasters, Latin America and Southern Africa.